Pearl Girl is going to get married before me. It's so humiliating.
What if Gilead's greatest mistake was giving certain women the freedom to leave? Not permanently, not completely, just enough to see the world beyond its borders. Because the deeper you look into the Testaments, the more it feels like the Pearl Girls are becoming something far more dangerous than missionaries. They are becoming witnesses. And authoritarian systems fear witnesses more than enemies sometimes. At first glance, the Pearl Girls seem like the perfect representatives of Gilead. Calm, disciplined, devoted. They travel outward, carrying the image the regime wants the world to see. Faithful young women spreading belief and bringing others towards salvation. But underneath that image is a flaw Gilead may not fully understand yet. The moment people experience another way of living, control becomes harder to maintain. That is the hidden danger surrounding the Pearl Girls. Unlike most women trapped entirely inside Gilead's rigid structure, they move between different societies. They hear different conversations, they observe different relationships between men and women. They witness people existing without the constant pressure of surveillance and religious performance. And those experiences matter more than Gilead realizes. Because dictatorship depends heavily on isolation. People remain obedient when they believe there is no alternative. When the system feels permanent, questioning it becomes emotionally difficult. But once somebody sees another version of life with their own eyes, certainty begins to crack. Not loudly, quietly, internally. That is how belief starts weakening. One of the smartest details in the Testaments is how it portrays indoctrination as something fragile beneath the surface. Gilead constantly describes the outside world as immoral, broken, and spiritually empty. Women are raised to fear life beyond the regime's borders. But the Pearl Girls eventually discover something dangerous. Reality is more complicated than propaganda. They meet people who are kind even without Gilead, families who function without fear, women who speak freely without punishment hanging over every conversation. And once those contradictions enter somebody's mind, the system starts losing emotional control over them. That is why the Pearl Girls feel so important to the story. Not because they openly rebel, but exposure slowly changes perspective. And perspective changes loyalty. The truly ironic part is that Gilead created this problem itself. The regime wanted ambassadors capable of persuading outsiders emotionally, so it trained these women to communicate well, adapt socially, and understand human behavior. But in doing so, it accidentally gave them the exact tools needed to think independently. That contradiction may become catastrophic long-term. Because the more emotionally intelligent the Pearl Girls become, the harder it is for them to ignore hypocrisy around them. And hypocrisy is poison to systems built on absolute moral authority. Fear can force obedience for a while, but once people begin recognizing contradictions clearly, belief starts collapsing from the inside. The Pearl Girls are uniquely positioned to notice those contradictions everywhere. They see how Gilead presents itself publicly. Then they witness what actually happens underneath the surface. The fear, the secrecy, the emotional repression, and the unequal treatment hidden behind religious language. That creates internal conflict naturally, especially when combined with seeing other societies functioning without those same forms of control. And that internal conflict is where real danger begins for Gilead, because people do not need to become revolutionaries overnight to weaken a regime. Sometimes, emotional detachment alone becomes enough. Once somebody stops believing sincerely, they stop protecting the illusion with the same conviction. That may already be happening with the Pearl Girls. One of the most unsettling themes in the Testaments is how resistance often looks invisible at first. Not every threat arrives through violence or public rebellion. Sometimes, collapse begins in private thoughts, in hesitation. Doubt is spreading quietly between conversations. And honestly, the Pearl Girls fit that kind of resistance perfectly. They carry stories between worlds. They absorb perspectives Gilead cannot fully filter or control. Every mission exposes them to emotional realities that challenge the narrative they were raised to accept. Over time, those experiences accumulate. A question here, a contradiction there, a moment of realization that does not fully disappear afterward. That is how ideological systems begin weakening psychologically. Not all at once, piece by piece, Another important detail is that the Pearl Girls exist between performance and truth constantly. Publicly, they must represent unwavering faith in Gilead. But privately, many of them are likely processing things the regime never intended them to confront emotionally. And pretending to believe something is very different from truly believing it. That distinction matters enormously, because once enough people start performing loyalty instead of feeling it genuinely, the foundation underneath authoritarian systems becomes unstable. Gilead depends on emotional certainty. It needs people to believe the structure is righteous, necessary, and permanent. But the Pearl Girls may slowly become proof that certainty is fading. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. And internal shifts are often the beginning of larger collapses. One of the darkest possibilities is that Gilead completely misunderstands the difference between obedience and devotion. The regime assumes compliance automatically means loyalty. But history shows those things are not the same at all. People can follow rules while emotionally disconnecting from the system enforcing them, and emotionally disconnected individuals become unpredictable over time. That unpredictability may be exactly what the Pearl Girls represent. Not organized rebellion, something quieter. Women are beginning to see beyond the world Gilead built around them. Women recognizing that fear has shaped much of what they were taught to call faith. Women realizing the outside world is not the nightmare they were raised to imagine. That awareness spreads slowly, but once it begins, it becomes difficult to stop completely. Because doubt travels differently than propaganda. It moves through emotion, through experience, through small realizations people cannot unsee once they happen. And honestly, that may be why the Pearl Girls are so dangerous to Gilead's future. The regime created them to expand its influence outward. Instead, they may become the reason belief inside the system starts weakening altogether. Not through war, not through violence, but through perspective. Because once enough people start seeing beyond the illusion, the structure holding everything together begins cracking from underneath itself. And the scariest part for Gilead may be this. By the time the commanders recognize what is happening, it may already be too late. And the most dangerous part is that this shift would not look like rebellion at first. There would be no dramatic turning point, no sudden rejection of Gilead's ideology. Instead, it would appear almost invisible from the outside. A Pearl Girl still speaks the correct words, still follows procedure, still performs devotion. But internally, the certainty begins to soften. Questions don't get answered as easily anymore. Comparisons linger longer. The outside world stops feeling like a distant myth and starts feeling like a real alternative that actually exists. That kind of mental shift is subtle, but it changes how obedience feels over time. Less like faith and more like performance. And once performance replaces belief, the foundation of Gilead becomes unstable in a way force cannot easily fix. Because you cannot punish a thought that has already formed quietly inside someone's mind. You can only control what they do with it outwardly. That is why the Pearl Girls represent something Gilead cannot fully police: internal perspective. They move between worlds too freely, and every return brings back something the regime cannot filter out completely. Even a single contradiction carried by one girl can spread slowly through conversations, observation, and memory. And that is how systems that once felt unshakable begin to weaken, not through loud collapse, but through quiet erosion from within.